Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the 2024 Hot Topics in Environmental Law Summer Lecture Series. I'm Jenny Rushlow, Dean of the Maverick Lloyd School for the Environment, Faculty Director of the Environmental Law Center, and Professor of Law here at Vermont Law and Graduate School. Thanks for coming today. Each of these talks is worth 1 CLE credit in Vermont. So if you'd like to claim that credit, you just need to keep track of the talks for your own records. And we will have time for Q&A at the end of the session today. Welcome back to the 2024 Hot Topics in Environmental Law Summer. Sorry about that. If you are watching the talk today on the VLGS YouTube, you can enter any questions that you have in the chat space, and we will collect those and get through as many as we can. And you're welcome to enter those questions during the talk, after the talk, whatever you'd like. Today, we are very pleased to welcome our speaker, Eastland Gambert. Eastland Gambert is the professor and director of the Fundamentals of Lawyering program, as well as faculty co-director of the Animal Legal Education Initiative at George Washington University Law School. And Eastland's scholarship spans multiple fields, including language and rhetoric, critical animal studies, critical race theory, food law and policy, and feminist legal theory. She has written extensively on the subject of milk. Her article, Got Milk, with a Y, The Disruptive Possibilities of Plant Milk. And this article was identified by the Wall Street Journal as a notable and quotable piece. She's also a recipient of the 2019 Aspen Words Emerging Writer Fellowship. She holds a Bachelor of Arts from Pomona College and graduated with honors from George Washington Law. And today her talk is titled The Milk Wars. Please join me in welcoming Eastland Gambert.
Thank you so much, Jenny. Let me share my screen. Can you give me a thumbs up, Jenny, if you can see my screen? Okay, great. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. It's a real honor. Thanks, Jenny and Delcy, Laura, Courtney, and just the entire Vermont Law and Graduate School community for inviting me here, both today to give this talk and to be the distinguished animal scholar for these 2 weeks. It's just a total thrill and honor to be here in South Royalton. So as you can see, the title of this talk is The Milk Wars, and it's also the working title of a manuscript that I'm working on about milk. And I've spent a lot of time over the last 8 years or so thinking about and writing about milk. And I thought I'd start out by saying just a little bit about why milk fascinates me so much. So first, milk fascinates me because it is one of the most ubiquitous substances on the planet. It means a lot of different things to a lot of people. And milk is often thought of as the substance of life. It's often thought of as the thing that distinguishes mammals from other species, although there is some interesting research calling that into question. In English, it is even the inspiration behind the name of our very own galaxy, the Milky Way. But milk is also personal to me. I'm half Norwegian, and I grew up spending every summer of my life in a tiny cabin off the grid, deep in the Norwegian wilderness. Down the rocky path from my family's cabin is this tiny mountain farm that you can see in the middle of the slide here, and it operates only for 2 months every summer. It's been operating like that for over 150 years. It's this place where farmers from the valley send their cows, about 20 of them every year, for just those couple of months so that they can be milked twice a day, and then for the rest of the day, they roam and graze freely up in the Norwegian wilderness. My family has a long relationship with this farm that spans multiple generations. That is my teenage nephew, Storm, on the left, and my cousin, Stian, on the right. Stian is about 20 years older than me, and he has spent every summer for the last 45 years or so milking the cows at this tiny mountain farm every summer. And Storm, for the last few years, has been his apprentice. And when I was a teenager, I was Stian's apprentice too. So I know that I'm speaking to you from Vermont, and maybe a disproportionate number of people joining me in this presentation, because maybe you're also in Vermont, have had the experience of getting to know cows sort of on a personal basis. And that's definitely not something that most people that I grew up with in New York had the opportunity to do. But if you have had the opportunity to get to know cows, you'll know that, like cats and dogs and really all animals, they're all unique. They all have their own personalities. The cows in Norway all have names. And every summer I got to know them, just like we get to know our companion animals that might live with us at home. So this is Rosa Hjarta, which means pink heart, on the left. Maybe you can see why she has that name. And that's Gri on the right. And growing up knowing these cows led me to becoming a vegetarian when I was about 12. I just had this realization at around that age, like, if I'm not eating my cats, then I really don't think I can be eating cows that I also have this sort of more sort of intimate and familiar relationship with. But it wasn't until later, sometime in my 20s, when I first really considered the unnaturalness of being in a barn full of lactating mothers with absolutely no babies in sight. And I think that I was living for a long time with some sort of cognitive dissonance that allowed me to sort of think on some level that dairy cows was some sort of, I don't know, sort of magical being or special kind of subspecies where these particular cows just produce milk spontaneously. And I thought, well, as long as they're producing milk, it's fine for humans to be consuming it. But then I just suddenly sort of connected all the dots and the invisible became visible. And when that happened, my whole world shifted. And when I realized sort of the how much about dairy cows' lives had been invisible to me, despite spending so much time with them growing up, everything sort of shifted in my life. Not only did I become vegan, but I got involved in the animal advocacy movement. And I started working on thinking about and writing about and teaching about animals in my professional life. I've always been fascinated by the way language and culture shapes our laws in our society. And so I started thinking about the many ways in which we humans use language and culture and our legal system to create and perpetuate systems of oppression and exploitation of non-human animals, but also of humans as well. And inspired by my lifelong connection with these Norwegian cows, I have been thinking a lot about these topics sort of through the lens of milk. And what really fascinates me about milk is that as central as it is to our civilization, it's really far from clear what milk actually is and what it's not. Dictionary, legal, and cultural definitions are often at odds with each other, and that has resulted in some really fascinating legal and cultural battles that have been taking place around the globe. Anytime anyone wants to figure out what a word means, whether you're a lawyer or a layperson, the dictionary is often a pretty good place to start. So we're going to do that now. The Oxford English Dictionary has actually a multitude of definitions for this word milk, but just a glance at the primary, sort of the first definition that you'll come to when you look up the word milk, reveals that the word is thought of as being inherently both female and animal in nature. And this definition is particularly interesting to me, given that it is actually possible for male bodies to lactate. And also plants are well known to produce a substance that is commonly referred to as milk. And yet neither of these substances would qualify as milk here in this primary dictionary definition. In the United States, government regulations have taken a very narrow view of milk and have defined it as the lacteal secretion, practically free from colostrum, obtained by the complete milking of one or more healthy cows. So this definition is notable because it excludes not only plant-based milk and milk from humans, but also milk from sheep or goats and even unhealthy cows. In the European Union, we also have a regulatory definition of milk that narrowly defines milk as animal in nature, except for a few carefully delineated exceptions. And this is the definition in the European Union that's been in place for roughly the last 30 years. So these are just a few of the primary dictionary and legal definitions of this word milk, and just a few sort of tendrils of these tensions that are inherent in the word. And I think you can maybe already see that it's a word and a concept that is itself a battlefield, and it's one that I want to unpack more deeply with you here today. So the last decade or so has been this pretty tumultuous one for milk on both sides of the Atlantic, as consumers in the United States and Europe are increasingly concerned about the wide-scale suffering baked into the animal agriculture industry, as well as the widespread negative impact that that industry has on the environment and climate change. Plant milk sales have been rising in recent years, and the demand for dairy milk has been falling. It might be said that some dairy milk producers and advocates appear somewhat threatened by plant milk's steady rise in popularity, and dairy milk advocates have been waging this war against plant milk, fighting legal, legislative, regulatory, linguistic, and cultural battles over not only the word milk, but also over the cultural space that milk occupies. And before I dig into this battle, I just want to point out, I think, another important definition, which is that despite the primary dictionary definition in the Oxford English Dictionary defining milk as animal in nature, there is also a definition in the dictionary that recognizes the fact that milk can also come from plants. Plant-based milks can be traced back a really long way. There's research indicating that the oldest explicit references to the term plant milk date back to the 4th century AD. And there are numerous other examples across cultures and throughout history of plant milk being a commonly used phrase, and also specific types of milk like hazelnut milk or soy milk or oat milk or whatever. So a moment ago, I showed you the slide with the official legal definition of milk in the United States. If you remember, it was the lacteal secretion, practically free from colostrum, obtained by the complete milking of one or more healthy cows. What is notable about this definition is that the US Food and Drug Administration, or the FDA, has long chosen not to enforce that narrow definition. And over the last number of years, a group of lawmakers has been using a variety of tactics to try to compel the FDA to enforce that narrow animal-based definition of milk. There's been a lot of litigation on the topic as well. It's mostly centered around whether consumers are confused or misled by plant milk products using the word milk to describe itself. So in light of all of this litigation and attempts to compel the FDA to enforce its own definition of milk, it was a pretty big deal in February 2023 when the FDA published these draft guidelines on, quote, the labeling of plant-based milk alternatives and voluntary nutrient statements. In the draft guidance, the FDA explained that it had collected over 13,000 comments on this issue of whether or not consumers might be confused or misled by products that identify themselves as plant milk. And they also did their own independent research and ran a bunch of focus groups. And they determined that consumers, quote, understand that plant-based milk alternatives are distinct products and choose to purchase plant-based milk alternatives because they are not milk. In response to the FDA publishing these draft guidelines for plant milk to be allowed to call itself milk, a bipartisan group of senators, including Peter Welch from Vermont, reintroduced the Dairy Pride Act in 2023. And the Dairy Pride Act was actually first introduced by a different but sort of overlapping bipartisan group of senators back in January 2017. Dairy Pride stands for Defending Against Imitations and Replacement of Yogurt, Milk, and Cheese to Promote Regular Intake of Dairy Every Day Act. And if passed, it would update the US Code section on misbranded food to prohibit plant-based products from using terms like milk, yogurt, or cheese on their labels. The act includes, without any explanation or justification, the statement that, quote, plant-based products labeled as milk are misleading to consumers. In a February 2023 press release about the reintroduction of the Dairy Pride Act, Senator Tammy Baldwin of Wisconsin specifically called out the FDA and the draft guidelines that it had just published. And she referred to those draft guidelines as ill-advised and anti-dairy. But the FDA's draft guidance was not a total win for plant milk advocates either. In its guidance, the FDA also called on plant milk companies to incorporate what it called voluntary nutrient statements into its packaging to specifically identify the ways in which that particular product might differ nutritionally from dairy milk. That is in addition to the regular nutritional information being available on the back of the carton. So you can see here on the right-hand side of this slide an example of the sort of voluntary nutrient statement that the FDA proposes in its draft guidelines. The Animal Legal Defense Fund, or ALDF, submitted a comment to the FDA in April 2023, arguing that the FDA's suggestion that plant milk products incorporate these voluntary nutrient statements into its packaging is punitive against those plant milk products. The ALDF points out that the FDA has never imposed such a one-way recommendation like this before, and noted that the FDA is not recommending that dairy milk also include voluntary nutrient statements to explain ways in which it differs nutritionally from different forms of plant milk. For example, identifying that dairy milk might contain more cholesterol or saturated fat than plant milk. So the FDA has yet to issue its final recommendations, but suffice it to say, this remains a very contested space in the sort of milk battlefield here in the United States. But for now, at least, plant milk is allowed to call itself milk here in the US. And that fact actually sets the US apart from many countries, including the entire European Union and the UK. Unlike in the US, the European Union actually does consistently enforce that regulatory language that we saw on that earlier slide. And the most recent time that it did so was in a case coming out of the European Court of Justice in the summer of 2017. So that means that while it's common to see plant-based products for sale in the US using words like milk, butter, or cheese, those same products in the European Union or the UK will use words like drink, beverage, or spread. So here you can see the US and UK versions of Oatly oat milk, with the US version calling itself milk on the left and the UK version calling itself drink on the right. And what's interesting, I think, is that not only is the label, sort of the descriptor, milk versus drink different, but if you zoom in, you see that the sort of normative description of the product also is different. So in the United States, Oatly contains no dairy, no soy, no whatever. But in the UK, Oatly contains no milk, no soy, no whatever. So in the UK, Oatly is not only dairy-free, but it is also milk-free, whatever that means. I just want to point out a small tangent, which is that obviously the United Kingdom is no longer a member of the European Union, and there's been litigation on this question of milk and whether plant milk can call itself milk in the UK. And the latest case about this issue was just decided in December 2023 by the Chancery Division of the High Court. That case was a case brought by Oatly versus Dairy UK Limited. And in that case, the court held that plant milk cannot call itself milk to describe the nature of the product. So the court aligned itself with the European Court of Justice decision. But it actually found that plant milk products are allowed to use the word milk in non-descriptive trademarks. Oatly actually has this trademark that's called the post-milk generation. And the court in the UK said, as long as you call yourself drink, you can use that trademark post-milk generation. So speaking of Oatly, I'm going to do a little bit more of a deep dive into Oatly. It's a really interesting sort of case study that like really frames some of these milk wars that have been going on, especially in Europe. Oatly, you might know, is a small Swedish plant milk company, an oat milk company that has really been at the center of some of the most interesting legal and cultural milk wars beyond the one I just mentioned. This is an image from the London Underground from October 2018. And Oatly's annual sales are roughly 200 times less than those of the Swedish dairy industry. But these words that you can see here on the slide, it's like milk, but made for humans. You know, Oatly designed those words to be provocative and sort of attention grabbing, and that is part and parcel of Oatly's entire marketing strategy. But 10 years ago, in 2014, these exact same 7 words were the subject of a contentious legal battle in Sweden between Oatly and the Swedish dairy lobby. In 2014, the Swedish dairy lobby sued Oatly in Swedish market court, arguing that Oatly was misleading consumers. This was not actually a fight over Oatly using the word milk on its packages. Like I just described, Oatly was not doing that. It was calling itself drink, in accordance with the EU regulations. Instead, the Swedish dairy lobby focused its allegations on the witty and often humorous wording that Oatly used on its packages and website, claiming that those phrases misled consumers into believing that dairy milk is bad for humans. Given the extent to which dairy has long been bound up in Sweden's cultural identity, the nation was transfixed as this case unfolded in the courts, in the media, and online in social media spaces. In November 2015, the Swedish Market Court issued a 62-page decision that tackled language, rhetoric, human psychology, and the ability of the average Swede to grasp specific messages articulated in English. The court largely sided with the dairy lobby, and it banned Oatly from using that phrase, "It's like milk but made for humans." It also banned Oatly from using phrases like "no milk, no soy, no badness." The court reasoned that these phrases improperly claim Oatly products to be superior to dairy products, and implied that dairy milk and other dairy products are unsuitable for humans. Even though it lost this legal battle, Oatly considered this lawsuit a win. It just put Oatly on the map around the world. Their sales skyrocketed in Sweden and across Europe. They ended up moving into the US market. And Oatly co-founder Björn Östes said that the lawsuit was, quote, "the best thing that ever happened to the company, hands down." In an interview with The Guardian after these ads came out in the London Underground, Oatly CEO Tony Peterson was asked if he was afraid that there might be similar legal repercussions in the UK stemming from using the same exact marketing language that had ended up banning this language in Sweden, on its products in Sweden. And Tony Peterson said, "There might be some legal consequences, I don't know, but am I concerned about it? No, I'm not. I mean, it's just true. Who could argue with the fact it's like milk but made for humans? How can that be wrong?" Given that Oatly sales are still dwarfed by dairy milk sales, and the same is true for plant milk sales really in every country around the world, it may seem a little strange that dairy milk advocates are so motivated to fight these legal milk wars against plant milk companies. But when you look at the sales data, it's a little easier to understand why dairy milk advocates feel a little threatened. Plant milk is no longer fringe or counterculture. It currently represents about 15% of the total milk market in the United States, and that number is increasing every year. People are drawn to plant milk for lots of reasons that dairy milk can't compete with, including a lower environmental footprint compared to dairy milk and fewer ethical concerns around animal welfare in the animal agriculture industry. Even the most resource-intensive plant milks, like almond milk, are more sustainable on the major metrics, including water use, than dairy milk. So I'm going to shift focus away from my legal analysis about milk and use my remaining time digging deeper into some of the cultural battles inherent in milk as well. We saw the earlier dictionary slides above that milk is defined as this substance that is constructed by our society to be explicitly female and animal in nature. What's interesting about that is that milk is also a word that by its very definition means to exploit. And so we have this word that by its very definition captures the relationship it has to the bodies that it comes from. And I want to walk through just a few examples of the ways in which milk has been used as a tool to regulate and control and sort of oppress and exploit both humans and non-human bodies. And so the first example is I want to look at some examples of controlling female-coded bodies through milk. In 1892, Edith Ward reviewed Henry Salt's book, Animal Rights. And in that review for this feminist British newsletter called Shafts, she wrote, quote, "The case of the animal is the case of the woman." Nearly a century later, in 1990, Carol J. Adams published her landmark work, The Sexual Politics of Meat. And that's a term that Carol Adams describes as capturing, quote, "the dangerous intersection of misogyny and speciesism." Adams argues that we, quote, "live in an oppressive world that creates interlocking oppression based on race, sex, class, and species," and argues that meat eating exists in and operates to legitimate a patriarchal world. And so I would argue it is with milk as well. So I'm just going to be showing some slides now that I just want to flag do contain some disturbing images and words that depict exploitation of humans and non-human animals, as well as some racist rhetoric and hate speech. And the reason I've decided that it's important to include these images and these words is to provide some real world and historical examples of ways that milk has been entangled with sexism, racism, and speciesism throughout history. So most of us probably think of non-human female bodies as being the ones primarily exploited and commodified in the milk industry, and that is undeniably true. The reproductive lives of female dairy cows are wholly controlled by the dairy industry, from artificial insemination to separating cows from their calves at or shortly after birth and denying them the ability to nurse their young. That was everything that was invisible to me when I was, growing up, spending my summers on that dairy farm. But there's also a long history and tradition of exploiting human female bodies for their milk. And my goal in raising this point is not to compare women to cows, but instead to recognize that they have both experienced forms of exploitation and control because of their capacity to make milk. In her article, Regulating Milk, Women and Cows in France and the United States, legal scholar Mathilde Cohn explained that analogizing human to non-human females, quote, "is not intended to debase women, but to uncover the different mutually reinforcing forms of oppression intersecting gender and species." So one of the ways that human female bodies have been exploited for their milk is through the wet nursing industry. And this is an industry that dates back thousands of years, and it regulated not only women's bodies, but also the innermost aspect of their private lives. There's examples from around the world of wet nurses' personal, sexual, and reproductive lives being severely regulated and controlled. Wet nurses often faced severe punishment if they did things like get pregnant during their wet nursing contract or feed other children, including their own children, while they were engaged in a wet nursing contract. In Hammurabi's code from 1754 BC, women actually faced the penalty of having their breasts cut off if they broke their wet nursing contracts. Human milk was actually the most frequently advertised commodity in 18th century United States, but not all wet nurse milk was always paid for. And in fact, during the time of slavery in the United States, it was not uncommon for slaveholders to force enslaved women to serve as wet nurses for their children, sometimes requiring that the enslaved women stop breastfeeding their own children in order to give all of their milk exclusively to the children of their owners. There's also examples of non-human animals being used as wet nurses for humans. And again, this is just another example of female bodies being used and controlled at the expense of a parent-child relationship and the mother's ability to feed her own young. There's countless other examples throughout history and across cultures, but female-coded bodies have long been regulated, controlled, and punished for their capacity to produce milk. I want to just very briefly touch on some of the ways that milk has been used in portrayals of human and non-human female bodies in popular culture to perpetuate tropes of femininity as being inherently, simultaneously sexual and wholesome at the same time. So here's 3 images, and images like these abound in milk advertising spanning the last 60 or so years. And it illustrates the ways that male-dominated media constructs narratives around milk and femininity to, like I said, simultaneously sexualize and domesticate human and non-human female bodies. So you have this milk ad on the left from about 1955 depicting this smiling blonde woman in a short skirt holding ice skates alongside the text, "Look better, cook better." And you have this ad in the middle from the first half of the 20th century that depicts a cow dressed as a demure housewife who is serving glasses of presumably her own milk to her family on a tray. And then on the right, you have this iconic Got Milk ad from the 1990s featuring pregnant supermodel Elle Macpherson with a milk mustache. And then there's this interesting reality that despite being this distinctly female-coded substance, milk also has been used as a symbol to perpetuate tropes of this very particular form of idealized white masculinity. So here we see this pair of ads, one from the 1930s on the left that says, "Milk makes men," and the latter boasting milk for real men. And that one is from 2012. Milk's entanglements with various tropes of masculinity could be the subject of a whole different talk. So I'm just gonna leave that there. But we've seen how milk has been used to exploit and control female bodies, and we've seen that people of color have been disproportionately impacted by this exploitation. Milk has been used both literally and symbolically to promote racist ideologies in other ways as well. The rhetorical link between dairy milk and whiteness has been used to justify and perpetuate notions of white superiority for centuries, and it's ongoing still today. Just a few examples of this. There were scientific experts from the late 19th and 20th centuries who considered dairy milk to be directly linked to the success and superiority of white Northern Europeans as a race. In his widely read 1918 book, The Newer Knowledge of Nutrition, nutrition scientist E.V. McCollum wrote that the people who have made liberal use of milk as a food have, in contrast to non-milk drinking peoples, attained greater size, longevity, and have been much more successful in the rearing of their young. They have been more aggressive than the non-milk using peoples and have achieved much greater advancement in literature, science, and art, and so on. The U.S. National Dairy Council published a pamphlet in the 1920s associating dairy milk with the perceived superiority of white bodies, saying that the people who are progressive in science and every activity of the human intellect are the people who have used liberal amounts of milk and its products, and they are sort of by reference there referring to sort of white Northern European people. And one more historical example, this 1933 History of Agriculture of the State of New York text declared that of all races, the Aryans seem to have been the heaviest drinkers of milk, and a fact that may in part account for the quick and high development of this division of human beings. So my research into the historical connections between milk and race also led me to two deeply offensive and explicitly racist images that I found in the Library of Congress database that I will share briefly. These are images that starkly illustrate the deeply ingrained racist narrative at the time. These are from 1916, according to the Library of Congress. This deeply ingrained racist narrative connecting milk to whiteness. Even as these explicitly racist sentiments and narratives have fallen out of favor, milk remains a substance that's bound up in problematic policies and practices that disproportionately impact people of color today. In the United States, a majority of workers in the dairy industry are immigrants and people of color. Immigrant labor accounts for roughly 51% of all dairy labor, and dairies that employ immigrant labor produces roughly 80% of the US milk supply. Jobs in the animal agriculture industry, including the dairy industry, are notoriously low in pay and can be grueling for both mind and body. The toll that this work takes on workers is not only physical, there is an emotional trauma that comes from animal agriculture work that has been shown through research to extend into the communities that the workers belong to. Studies have shown that even when controlled for all other factors, employment in the animal agriculture industry increases a community's total arrest rates and arrests for violent crimes compared to other industries. And then there's the reality that the nutritional guidelines and official food policies in the United States have been constructed in such a way that they've been declared racist for decades. US federal dietary guidelines state that, quote, dairy products are an important part of a healthy diet for both children and adults. Organizations like the Congressional Black Caucus criticize the guidelines for having a, quote, consistent racial bias for recommending substantial dairy intake, a recommendation that's difficult to follow for the majority of people of color who cannot digest lactase in milk. Although it may be unintentional, said Dr. Milton Mills with the Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine, the US dietary guidelines as they exist are, quote, really a fundamental form of institutionalized racism in a rather destructive and insidious format. Legal scholar Andrea Freeman argues that federal dietary guidelines are crafted in a way that perpetuates what she calls food oppression, which is what she defines as the institutional, systemic, food-related action or policy that physically debilitates a socially subordinated group. And the last example that I want to just very briefly touch on is the Trump-era phenomenon of the so-called alt-right using milk as a symbol of white supremacy. This started with a gathering of men toting milk cartons and yelling racist chants a few days after Trump's inauguration in January of 2017, and it went viral from there. From a milk emoji on Richard Spencer's Twitter bio to the viral hashtag #MilkTwitter being used to promote explicitly racist content to people bringing milk cartons with them to pro-Trump rallies. Milk emerged during the Trump administration as a symbolic tool that the alt-right used to promote notions of white superiority under the guise of ironic humor. So there you have it. It's a little journey into some of the battles of the milk wars. I hope this presentation helps give a little overview into some of the tensions inherent in milk as a word and as a concept, both legally and culturally, and the many ways in which the exploitation bound up in milk impacts humans and non-human animals alike. I just want to end with this very brief coda, which is that this image here I took last summer up at my family's cabin in Norway. I was contacted last year by a Dutch multimedia artist who is doing an exhibition in the Netherlands about milk and exploring milk from a variety of different perspectives. She found me online and wanted to interview me for the exhibit. So we met on Zoom. I told her about how my cousin and my nephew still spend their summers milking these cows in Norway, and how that same experience as a teenager set me on this different path towards veganism and animal advocacy, and spending a lot of my work as an academic thinking about animals and about milk. I invited her to visit us there, and she came to Norway last summer with a film crew to interview me and my family and spend time getting to know the cows as well. And the exhibition is going to be later this year. I'm excited to see it. And with that, I just want to thank you for your time. And I would be delighted to have any questions be sent to me via email. Here's my email address, and I'm looking forward to the Q&A. So thank you so much.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Islan. That was super interesting. We do have a few minutes to ask some questions from our audience. So for our audience members, again, you can enter questions in the chat space on YouTube, and we'll get through as many as we can. To kick things off, question from a listener is, as a white parent, pediatricians encourage us to give milk to our growing children. Do you see any movement among the American Pediatrics Association away from these guidelines?
Thanks for that question. I have to confess that I am not familiar with the sort of latest trend on what the latest guidelines are, but I do know that a vegan diet has been approved for children by pediatricians as a healthy option for parents to feed their children a vegan diet. The most important thing is making sure that your children get all the different nutrients they need, and that's true no matter what kind of diet you feed your children. And so there's obviously lots of ways to get your children all of the nutrients that they need that might be in dairy, calcium or vitamin D or whatever it is in plant-based food. So I think just the recommendation is that a vegan diet is it's something that has been sort of formally approved as a healthy and viable diet for children, as long as the parents are making sure that their kids are getting all the nutrients they need. And that's true with any diet. Thanks for the question.
Another question for the US versus UK oat milk product. Are you aware of any significant differences in sales due to the difference in marketing in those countries, or Sweden or other places?
That's such an interesting question, and thank you for it. I think that I don't know. I don't know, and I would like to know. But so unfortunately, I don't know the answer to your question. What I do know is that there have been studies in the United States, because not every product in the United States, even though they could use words like milk and butter, oat milk or whatever, cashew butter, they don't all do that. You will sometimes see products that are called oat drink or cashew spread in the United States. And those products do not sell as well. So it's actually been shown that using words like milk and butter with the identifier of what kind of milk or butter, cashew, oat, soy, whatever, those sell better, again, in a US to US comparison. In the United Kingdom and in the European Union, and I believe in Canada as well, you're not allowed to use words like milk and butter for these products. So there isn't the opportunity to not buy one of those products because it has the word drink. But I think, to your point, it might be that people are less inclined to buy them and might buy dairy products instead because of those descriptors. So that's an interesting place where I want to do more research. Thanks for the question.
Are you aware of any efforts to enforce the healthy cows portion of the FDA definition?
No, but I would like to ask that person to follow up and tell me more about it. I'm making a note.
Well, that's Professor Winder, so you know where to find her.
Okay.
And Delcy, if you want to follow up with any details, I'll pose the question again.
No, but I appreciate that question. Thank you.
You see a lot of products out there that are labeled milk product as opposed to milk. Is there any precedent for plant-based milk companies being able to use that language, or what is the restriction around that?
Well, so in the United States right now, according to these draft guidelines, so the official, the regulation the regulation prohibits even like sheep and goat milk from calling itself milk, right? But the FDA draft guidelines are saying, you know, oh, it's okay for plant milk to call itself milk, so they don't need to say milk product. But, you know, you're right, there are these, you know, dairy containing products like American cheese or whatever that might call itself like a milk product. And I guess given the FDA guidance document, I wouldn't see any reason why a plant like a vegan product or a plant-based product would choose to use the word product as an additional descriptor, because it's not required to do so. I will say that a lot of dairy advocates are, you know, a big source of their sort of argument is that plant milk is imitation milk. It should be labeled as such. It should be called imitation milk. And I think that's what the FDA guidelines have now said is not necessary. That's because consumers are not being misled or confused, that the products don't need to call themselves imitation.
Okay. Follow up from Professor Winders, who said, just that it has always struck me that so much milk comes from cows with mastitis, etc., in violation of the FDA's definition of milk as something that comes from healthy cows, that everyone seems to ignore that part of the definition.
I see. Yeah, thank you. Very, very interesting. I think that's completely correct, Professor Winders. And I mean, that entire definition is basically ignored in so many ways, right? We're not recognizing the healthy cows part. We're not recognizing the cows part. Even if plant milk was taken out of the picture, you have sheep and goat milk. And so the definition, I think, is one that the FDA is really choosing to ignore at sort of at every level of the phrasing. But it would be really interesting, I think, to dig into the concept of what is a healthy cow and how is that even, you know, being defined, and is there really any movement to sort of hold dairy producers accountable to what milk from a healthy cow even is?
Okay, audience question. I find many poor people and people of color often live with more pollutants, and I also find healthy, non-dairy, gluten-free, or other special diets are quite costly in food budgets. How do we factor this in?
Yeah, it's a really important question. I think there's a few things I can say. You know, I live in Washington, D.C., and there's a really sort of strong and thriving vegan community there. And there's a lot of places where that community has sort of sprung up from. And one is from the maybe like 1980s and 90s DC punk scene that also is sort of associated with vegan food culture. But there's also a really strong Black vegan food culture in Washington, D.C., and there's a lot of really amazing vegan soul food restaurants. And where I'm going with this is that there's a long history of vegan food actually being food that is available, you know, for decades in cities and maybe also in more rural communities like Vermont, but that are not necessarily more expensive, and that can be, you know, using sort of readily available grains and nuts and legumes, and doesn't have to be expensive the way that we think of when we go to a store and buy the sort of vegan specialty products, which definitely have a markup associated with them. I have a separate paper on sort of how to sort of strategies that I think would be effective for plant-based food to have more of a sort of fighting chance in the marketplace, and to give people the opportunity to buy those products and choose those products instead of animal-based products. And I think it's important to take a look at the fact that a lot of animal-based products, meat and dairy, are very greatly subsidized by the United States government. And so those prices are artificially lower. And there are very, very few subsidies lowering the price of fresh fruits and vegetables and other plant-based foods. And that's a choice, a political choice that could change. You know, you could take away the subsidies for meat and dairy. You could add subsidies for plant milk and fruits and vegetables. You could tax meat and dairy to make it sort of disproportionately more expensive to incentivize people to eat vegan and plant-based food. So I think a lot of these conversations, I think, should be happening at the level of how sort of society is choosing to make food available and sort of set price points that they're really not driven by the market. They're driven by sort of artificial subsidies that are really affecting the prices. So I think that if a person is a family and they want to try to have a more affordable way into eating a plant-based diet, it's always going to be relatively inexpensive to eat very basic, nuts and grains and beans and rice and things like that. But I definitely would love to live in a world where the government took a closer look and said, we have these more climate-friendly foods and animal-friendly foods in vegetables and fruit and vegetables and plant-based milk and other foods like that. Why don't we make it more affordable than animal-based food? And that's the policy that, that we could make as a society if we wanted to. Thanks for that question.
It's a great point about the subsidies. Is it clear in the milk subsidies that funding is specifically for dairy milk?
Yes.
Okay. The question, in states like Vermont, where dairy farms are smaller versus big ag, is there room for harmless milk production, dairy milk production, or should we move away from cow milk consumption entirely?
Yeah, that is a very important question in a state like Vermont. I think there's a lot in that question that should be unpacked. I mean, I think one is, what is harmless dairy production? I sort of come from the place that I don't believe that we should be commodifying living beings, just sort of full stop. So I don't really see a world where harmless dairy production exists. I think it is possible to allow a lactating cow to continue nursing her calf indefinitely, until she would naturally stop, and also milk that cow for milk to sell to humans. But I don't know enough about what that looks like and how much less milk for humans you would get, because this cow would also be giving milk to her young, to her calf. So I don't know. I think it would raise questions about whether or not that would be profitable for the company. And so I think in a state like Vermont, I recognize simultaneously that the dairy industry is deeply bound up in the culture of this state, just like it is in Scandinavia, where I'm from. And I think there's interesting examples of, there's a lot of I've seen some examples of this in the UK and in Australia, and I know it's happening in the US as well. I think Laura Fox is actually working on some of these projects, but this concept of transformation, where you work with farmers and you say, we want you, if you want to still stay a small farm, to stay a small farm, but you don't necessarily have to continue commodifying other animals to do it. There's other things that you could be farming that could be profitable for you. So there's examples of these farmers getting a lot of job training and funding and assistance and support to say, I'm going to continue being a farmer, but I might convert to being an oat farmer so I can make oat for oat milk, or making, mushrooms or hemp or other products that are going to remove the animal exploitation from the equation, but preserve the opportunity to still be a small farmer in a state where farming is so bound up with the cultural identity.
Where does support come from for farmers to make those kinds of transformations?
It does not come from nearly enough places. So that support could come from government policies, just like the dairy industry is subsidized. Those subsidized could instead, a decision could be made politically to say, we're going to be shifting that funding to support farmers to get that kind of training and sort of the bridge that they would need in those intermediary years where they're sort of winding down one kind of farming and picking up another. So right now that funding doesn't exist on a wide scale at the governmental level. And I think that it should. And I think that's a place where advocates could do more work. There are some nonprofits that are working in this space. There's several around the world, and they're sort of working with individual farms on sort of a case-by-case basis to provide them with training and assistance and funding. But definitely this is something that we're sort of at the beginning stages of, and that I hope we'll see really growing as a model into the future.
Okay, we'll just have one more, which is, do you know how long humans have been consuming dairy milk? Is this a relatively new diet, or has it been consumed over the ages and only recently politicized?
Great question. It's like, I think over 10,000 years. There's interesting history about it. Humans, so humans are the only animals that drink milk after infancy, and we're the only animal that drinks the milk of other species. And we, as a species, lack the enzyme to digest lactase. And I think only 35% of all humans actually have that, have a gene mutation actually that allows them to digest lactase. And so it's actually called lactase persistence, the ability to digest lactase. Lactose intolerance is the norm by a lot in the global population. So about 10,000 years ago, these sort of lactase hotspots, as they've been called by scientists, developed. And one of those hotspots is in Northern Europe, but another is in the Indian subcontinent. And there's a few others around the world. And people that lived in those places thousands of years ago developed the ability to digest milk. And so it's definitely not a new thing, but it does set us apart as a species. And I guess you could say it's recently become politicized. Yes. Thanks for the question.
Okay, we'll wrap it up there. Thank you so much, Professor
Jenny.
Gambert. Thank you for the presentation. Thank you to the audience for questions. And thank you for coming today. And our next talk will take place next Tuesday online at 12. Have a good day, everybody. Stay cool.
Thank you.